Okay, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country or world you're in. My name is Mike Pavlak. I'm a solution consultant with Zen Technologies. I've been with Zen for about 3 years now, helping the account management team spread the good news of PHP to IBM and Linux, Windows customers as well. Been around the I for about 20 some odd years, and did a little bit of mainframing before that, and been having a good time working with the folks at Zen and PHP, specifically on IBM for just even longer than I've been working at Zen. So just having a good time here. Today's presentation is a focus on an introduction to object-oriented PHP. It's really geared for the IBM community. That's how I've tailored this presentation, although I probably should have included that in the title. Primarily because I, as an IBM developer, RPG developer for 20 plus years, really struggled with the whole world of OO, and I found a way that worked for me that I want to kind of share with you guys, and get your feedback and answer any questions that might pop up during the presentation. So, like always in all my presentations, I like to see interactivity. Feel free to ask questions via the chat interface or the QA. Otherwise, we'll definitely ask questions at the end of the presentation, but if you have a question that comes up during the presentation, feel free to jot it in there so that we have it in there. We don't miss it at the end in case it slips your mind or slips my mind, something like that. Okay. Now, first of all, a couple of pieces of housekeeping. We've got a couple of courses out at Zen.com. Our courses are designed to be not terribly intrusive. They're also a pretty darn good bargain too. The coursework that we offer at Zen typically runs in about an 18-19 hour format, 2 hours a day, every other day for 3 weeks, sort of a thing. And the nice thing about that is that you can get a good understanding of the course material. It's a live instructor-led classes, but you can also weave them into a busy schedule, so you can get caught up on you can stay caught up with your work and still pick up a new skill here and there. Now next week. Actually, I take that back. It's the week after next. We're going to be firing up the Foundations course, Foundations for IBM programmers, and that course is designed specifically. It's taught by someone who knows IBM and PHP. In fact, June 13th is when the class launches, and it'll be taught by myself, by me. So feel free to enroll early and often. The Foundations course is a great place to start, but if you've already had Foundations, then we can talk about the Higher Structures course. I'll talk more about that at the end of the presentation. But really, what I wanted to do is take a second to show you the plan or the development path for IBM developers as well as Linux and Windows developers. We really have this grid that's designed to help folks move forward with their PHP training, regardless of where you are in the food chain. If you've never done PHP before, or if you're just starting out, our Foundations courses are a great place to start. The Higher Structures course is essentially an OO programming, PHP object-oriented programming. We also have places for experienced object-oriented developers to kind of jump on as a quick start and not spend a lot of time doing the remedial work. They can kind of hit the ground running, so to speak. Specifically with regards to security, we've got a very solid course that talks about web application development security using PHP. And then, of course, our very, very popular, wildly popular Zen Framework courses. The Zen Framework Fundamentals always pleases, it always runs, we always have a full crowd. And our Zen Framework Advanced Concepts has been selling out like crazy, so that's a huge class as well. From a product perspective, Zen Studio and Zen Server, we certainly have courses to support those products, and the Zen Studio course is just great for a lot of the things that we're doing today with regards to the object-oriented perspective, using Zen Studio for object introspection and project management and that kind of stuff. Zen Server training, of course, for our Linux and Windows brethren, as well as the IBM folks, but primarily for things like clustering and that kind of stuff. So a full palette of coursework available at Zen.com. We would welcome you to come out and check it out anytime you want. All of our information's up on our website. Spirit of full disclosure, you can see as much as you want. If you have any questions, just get a hold of your friendly account manager, or you could even send me a note. And again, the Foundations course is a great place to start. That's where I recommend you start, and that's where I started some time ago. All right. Now, let's say you've been doing a little bit of PHP, or you still want to do a little PHP. Our annual conference is coming up in October, and October is coming up really, really fast. So ZenCon 2011 in Santa Clara, California. I've been working with the management team, the project team, to lay out the coursework, and we've got some really exciting courses laid out for you. A lot of good content, a lot of great keynotes, an opportunity to network and meet with people in the community. We usually have a variety of events that are tied to ZenCon that are both included with the conference, and sometimes after hours. Great opportunity to meet with people from around the world doing PHP work. We've had folks from Australia and Europe and Asia, and there's no practical limits on any of that stuff. So come check us out. ZenCon will be a huge hit October 17th through the 20th. Now, with regards to this presentation, we're going to focus in on the object-oriented or introduction to object-oriented PHP. Looking for the right audience. So, are you new to PHP, or are you new to object-oriented design? That's really an important concept here. If you're open to new ideas and methods, this is huge. This is not going to be a deep dive into OO. Our Higher Structures course really does a great job at that, and you need to take some time to deep dive into OO. You can't do that, in my humble opinion, in an hour. So I'm going to focus in on the high level, again, focusing on folks who are maybe experimenting with the procedural model of PHP and looking to move forward with OO. There's a lot of ways, a lot of tricks I'm going to show you to help move you along that food chain. Now, what are we going to do? In this presentation, we're going to review a couple of PHP basics, nothing fancy. We're not going to spend a lot of time elaborating, but I'll just kind of gloss over some of the basics of PHP. We'll get into the class. Right, the class is really the recipe for an object. We'll talk about the components of an object, properties, methods, some additional object-oriented concepts, and of course, where do you go to get started? How do you hit the ground running? Because I can talk for hours on this stuff, but until you start playing with it, it really doesn't matter much. So we'll try and give you as much information as you can. Now, the basic roadmap that I followed, and I would recommend anyone else to follow as well, and regardless of whether you come to Zen for the training, or if you go out on the street, or you get a book, or you do it on your own, there's tutorials, that kind of stuff. Certainly, we at Zen can help you move that ball forward from a training perspective without any problem at all. But if you're starting off in the green screen and you want to move to that level of PHP expertise, starting somewhere is important, and this is not a bad place. So the webinars we have at Zen.com are huge. We have presentations in a variety of places, local user group conferences and large conferences and that kind of stuff. So we try to make it around as much as we can. But of course, our training classes are a great way to go as well. So starting off with procedural PHP is not unusual. It's not harmful. There are some folks who maybe disagree with that kind of stuff, but when you're transitioning from an RPG world like I did into a new language, one of the keys is you have to be productive fairly quickly. So being able to develop in a procedural model of PHP works very well because you can get some things done and demonstrate productivity while you're keeping the boat afloat and moving projects forward. And the advantage there is that you learn more as you play with it, right? Kind of like maybe how you learned RPG. If you go back to the old days and when you learned RPG, you started off with something basic, something very straightforward, and you moved into the more complex stuff like subfiles later on. So the path here, starting at procedural PHP and then moving into the object-oriented realm, is really kind of a natural fit. Not a problem at all. Once you've covered, the procedural model, the object-oriented model, and you're comfortable with that, then Zen Framework becomes a really good way to solidify, to reinforce that object-oriented knowledge. Now, I would not argue the point that if you're comfortable enough with procedural PHP and you want to jump into Zen Framework, you can learn object-oriented, by getting into the Zen Framework realm. However, one of the things that I recommend I strongly recommend is that you don't bite off too much. Don't bite off more than you can chew. I have had customers in the IBM realm who tried to start with Zen Framework, didn't know anything about PHP, and got really frustrated. And that's a terrible thing. We want you to be successful. So the recipe that worked for me was starting off in the procedural realm and getting into the OO and then moving into frameworks. But then again, your mileage may vary, so I encourage you to experiment a little bit and have some fun with it. Certainly, by the time you get comfortable with framework, then looking at a PHP certification, maybe right up your alley, to kind of make sure that you've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's on your training. Again, any questions at all, please, by all means, type them in via the chat or the QA panels. We'll be happy to jump on those questions as time permits, and I look forward to answering any questions or issues you guys might have. Let's see here. I'm going to go to full screen view here. Okay, so let's do a quick review of PHP basics. Variables. Right? We got to start off someplace, and variables is the place to start to do a quick review. Variables, again, are case sensitive. They begin with $signs, right? Very basic stuff here. Camel case notation is probably the most popular example of variables you'll see out there, but having a leading underscore is not the end of the world. Embedded spaces are not allowed, so obviously that's not a variable. Variables are implicitly cast, right? They're dynamically typed. So we see that information on a regular basis, and that becomes a very powerful asset in our arsenal as we're building applications. And then, of course, we have the support for constants and so on and so forth. Variables and their types, right? Remember, we've got 4 scalar data types: integer, floating point, strings, and booleans. And then we've got the other 4 data types, which are what we call the complex data types. Objects is one of them. Arrays, we've definitely heard a lot about arrays. Null and resource variables. So again, PHP is a very powerful language, gets a lot done with very little in its toolbox, so it makes your job a little bit easier because you know exactly where you stand with the language. When we get into variables, we talk about the scope of variables, and there's a couple of rules that we try to follow as best we can. Certainly variables can exist in the global scope, where they're available everywhere except inside of a function, unless you enable them via the global keyword. Local variables are available only inside of a function and typically destroyed at the end of the function. And of course, static variables, which are available inside of a function but remain persistent from one call to the function to the next. Great for things like accumulators and counters and that kind of thing. Then, of course, there's the array data type, which is very, very powerful. I've spent a lot of time talking to the community about arrays in PHP because PHP does not support data structures like RPG does or like COBOL does. So arrays becomes a very, very important concept to be comfortable with because you'll see a lot of examples of arrays, the enumerated, the associated, the multidimensional arrays, all very important things. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes here on functions because functions are very important when you're moving into the object-oriented realm. We're going to use the building blocks that we've learned in the procedural model to do object-oriented development. This is one of the things that makes working in the procedural realm advantageous because as you start to absorb the object-oriented world, you don't have to sit there and try and figure out, okay, the syntax of this and the syntax of that, and how does the language behave here, there, or everywhere else. So it's important to understand that you've got a lot of flexibility here. And functions is essentially one of the things that we're going to use as we go into the object-oriented realm. As we know, functions come from one of 3 places. They're either built into the language, part of base PHP. Things like string to upper, for example, would be a good example of built-in function. There's extensions that are built by third parties like IBM. Their DB2 functions are extensions to PHP. And then, of course, there's the user-defined functions. These are the ones that we create, right? We create a function that's going to do something, maybe because we're going to have some repeated business logic. We want to organize our code base in a certain way. So using functions makes a lot of sense to organize our logic and make it more approachable and manageable. So functions are very, very huge. What do functions look like? Ooh, that didn't render very well. Basically, functions have a name, they have parameters, and they have a result. And remember, the return value is always returned, and there's always one value. And if we want to return more than one value from a function, we would simply return an array, and that'll work out very, very well for us. Okay, so I talked about scope. I'm going to skip over that slide for a second here. Parameters. Parameters are very powerful when it comes to functions. There's the default values that are assigned via the parameter interface. Parameters by default are passed by value, as opposed to like an RPG program calling another RPG program where we default pass by reference. Different fundamental thing there. We can override the pass by reference by using the ampersand in the interface, and of course we can determine how many variables are being passed in and out of a function by using a couple of different functions like the function getArgs or function numargs. Those are very powerful. If you've ever used a program status data structure, for example, to determine the number of parameters passed into an RPG program to make that RPG program behave slightly differently. I've done that. I thought it was kind of cool way back when I did it. But if you're not careful, you can make things break real easy too. In the case of PHP, you've got a lot of flexibility there. You can actually retrieve an array of the arguments. You can get the number of the arguments, or get a specific argument somewhere within your function, and you're off to the races. Okay. So that was a whirlwind introduction to the PHP world, so to speak, or at least a review of basic PHP technology. Now let's get into the object-oriented realm. And one of the things I want to do when we get into the object-oriented realm is stress the fact that everything that you will work with in the object-oriented realm, you have already worked with in the procedural realm. Now, the folks in the object-oriented world, they tend to be elitists. I'm going to pick on them a little bit, and I realize I'm one of them kind of nowadays, but I still work a lot in procedural languages as well. But in the object-oriented realm, they tend to think they're better than everybody else because they know OO, and that's not necessarily true. Now, they may be good, don't get me wrong, but better is always a relative term. And so what I want to do is make sure you understand that it's okay to recycle terminology, because that's all the object-oriented folks ever did. They just changed the names, but the behaviors are almost identical. So let's talk about that as we move through here. Keywords. First of all, we'll talk about a couple of the basic keywords, like class is a keyword that we're going to use when we actually build our object-oriented application. Function is a keyword we're going to use, and static is another keyword we'll use. Now, these are not terribly scary keywords. The class one you haven't seen before, but the other two you have. And the concepts with regards to how we work with object-oriented technology, like the class and the object, the instance, magic methods, and visibility, again, these are key concepts that you've already explored in a lot of different ways, and we're just going to kind of give you a new meaning, so to speak. So I stole a couple of these slides from a good friend of mine, Kevin Schrader, who's done a lot of good training with regards to object-oriented development in PHP, and this is one of his. So, while you may not be more comfortable with the more modern structure, don't feel like you need to follow it. So the important thing here is you can take your time learning object-oriented PHP. PHP allows you to do this because you don't need to be in a completely 100% object-oriented PHP script to use the object-oriented components. I'll show you an example of that later on, but we'll definitely cover some of this stuff here. Now, there's some basics that we tend to explore when we get into PHP and we start moving forward with our technology. When we first introduced PHP in a lot of my presentations, I show you a lot of bad habits. I mix and match PHP code with HTML code, and I show you everything in one big file, and then so on and so forth. So a couple of things we want to start to call out of your bad habits is certain things we want to do is keep some of our library files out of the document root. So it always is a good idea to try and keep as much out of the document root as possible. It's a great place to start, and by default, everybody starts there. But in general, we try to hide our stuff, and hiding things from the document root is not a bad thing to do. It's real easy to do, and just a matter of changing a couple of settings inside your Apache and PHP.ini files, and you're off to the races. Now, keeping your files as a .php extension makes your life a lot easier, unless you're really out to hide things for one reason or another. But it does tend to make things a lot easier from a development as well as a deployment standpoint. And then keeping data out of the document root. So what are we talking about? What are we talking about when we say keep data out of the document root? Well, in the case of PHP applications, you might create flat file data, CSV files and that kind of stuff, and or you might read them or upload them. And what you don't want to do is have anything in the document root that you don't want the world to be able to read, because most of the stuff in the document root tends to be readable so that you can display your pages. So you want to keep important things out of the document root as much as possible. Do not deploy with a php.info.php file. If you wanted to find out how many people actually have those things out there, go ahead and run that Google search and you'll see. And then, of course, you don't want to allow the web server to write to the document root if you can avoid it. Always validate your input. Never trust input from an external source. That's another key piece of advice, and you'll see examples of that as we move forward as well. Okay. One of the things that actually Kevin helped me understand when I was trying to absorb the PHP model of object-oriented development is that stop thinking about the solutions and start thinking, or should I stop thinking about the problems and start thinking about the application as a whole. The whole idea of the object model that as I understand it, is that it's centered around data and not logic. And that really helped me understand things quite well, because as an RPG developer, I tend to be faced with a challenge, and I write a program to fix the challenge. And that's a great way to do RPG. But one of the things that has evolved in the RPG realm is that we're moving towards things like sub-procedures and service programs. And sub-procedures and service programs kind of take a different approach. They kind of encapsulate smaller pieces of business logic, so that you don't have a whole monolithic program trying to attack one thing. You've got bits and pieces that you can assemble and recycle and reuse as time goes on. Well, the same approach works in the case of PHP, and works with functions, and it also works in the object-oriented model of PHP as well. Now, when we get into the definition of an object, we tend to look at the definition as it's essentially a data structure with functions and variables that are local to each object. And so one of the things you want to keep in mind is that data structures, we've worked with data structures in RPG, we've worked with data structures as far as arrays go in PHP. Functions, we worked with functions, we create functions, we use functions, and then variables. Okay, so what here is new? Nothing's new. This is all stuff we've worked with before. So, relax and just kind of enjoy the ride, as they say. Now, where do you want to get more information on PHP or object-oriented PHP and that kind of stuff? Certainly our training classes at Zen are attractive, but there's also the online website. PHP.net has a whole tutorial, has a lot of good content on PHP in the object-oriented realm as well. So great places to get information and fill out any knowledge you have about or you're looking to fill out about PHP. Now the class, this is something that has helped me kind of understand things a little bit. If you think about your RPG programs, right? Or even your PHP programs, but if you think about your RPG programs, you have source code, and when you feed that to the compiler, that creates object code, right? So at the end of the day, after you've compiled an RPG program, you've got the source code and the object code. Now, in theory, you could throw away the source code, you've got the object, you're ready to go. But most of us aren't that arrogant that we would throw away the source code, because you may have to make a change to that source code somewhere down the road, and you want to go ahead and leverage that as you're moving forward. So you maintain the source code, but the source code doesn't really, matter anymore. It's the object code that matters at that point, and that's a great way to think about the object-oriented realm of PHP. In the case of PHP, the source code for an object is called the class, or the class definition. So in this example here, we're kind of showing you at a very high level. I've got a piece of PHP code, and we're defining a class called customer. Right. So on line number 3, we basically define the class called using the keyword class, and the customer is the name of the class. Now, inside the curly braces is the entire class definition. It could be one line of code. It could be 1,000 lines of code. It really depends on your approach and how you attack things. But the advantage here, and I want you to think about this from a holistic standpoint, if I organize my application so that all of my business logic related to a customer is in one place, well, then all I really need to do then in order to use that business logic anywhere in my system would be to instantiate one instance of the customer class. So now I'm kind of organizing my things in such a way that I can access things quickly and easily because I know how everything's organized. So in this case, I'm showing you a customer, but you could also use the definition for maybe an item, product code, right? A lot of attributes and business logic associated with products. So I would create a class called product and then put all my good business logic related to products in that one place as well. You're not limited to that, but it's an approach that's worth exploring. Okay, so we've done Hello World in about a dozen different languages, and we did it in the procedural model of PHP. Let's do it in the object-oriented model of PHP as well. So in this example here, I've got about 15, 18 lines of code, and in here we've got a very, very simple example of a PHP class definition and how we actually would go about instantiating that class and executing some of the methods. Now, remember, the terminology you've all heard before, right? So we're going to recycle a lot of these things and make it very, very straightforward. In the example of Hello World, or the Hello World class, this class is basically going to display anything that's passed into it. So it's a simple message class, so to speak. And the idea here is that we've got everything in one PHP script. Now, this is not very common. Most cases, what I've seen when I've seen business applications, I would see an entire class would be in a separate file, a separate PHP code file, maybe a .php, maybe a .inc, something along those lines, but usually .php. And that separate file would simply be either included or required, at the time the application was built. Right, so typically it requires what you're going to use. Most people that I know who are using classes don't just include them; they actually do require them because they're important to the execution of the application. So in this example here, we're going to actually have the class definition, defined first, and then the actual code that manipulates it comes in afterwards. But you could certainly put the class definition in a separate file if you wanted to. Now, in this case, the class is called Hello, right? And the class name, HELLO, all right? And then there's my opening and my closing curly braces right there. And let me see if I can get the annotation tool going here. I want to use the pointer. I'm a big fan of the pointer here. Here we go. And let me move the dock off here a little bit. Here we go. And so the class definition on line number 6 basically says, hey, this is hello. And here's my opening curly brace and my closing curly brace down here on line number 11. So we can see the range there. Style depends on your approach. If you want the opening curly brace on the same line as the class definition or the line below, I'm not going to be too picky about that kind of stuff. But notice that in line number 7, we create something called $message. Now, $message is what we would call a property. Now, in most cases, we call it a variable. It's a variable called $message. And I've got a keyword in front of that variable that says public. And I'm going to get to that in just a second here. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to introduce the fact that that's a variable, right? So it's all it is, a variable. Now, in the case of the object-oriented realm, remember that I told you that object-oriented developers tend to have different names for things, right? Because they're special, they want to have special names for things. Well, in the case of an object, that wouldn't necessarily be just a variable. They call that a property, okay, a property. So if you're reading a book on object-oriented programming and they talk about properties, it's not unusual to say, okay, there you go. Line number 7 is a variable, it's a property. Line number 8 is a function, right, the function definition. And the function is called display, and display is essentially going to execute one line of code, and that's going to basically print something out. Right? That's all that function is going to do, display. Now, in the case of the object-oriented realm, they have a name for that, right? And that's called a method. In the case of the object-oriented model of PHP, the function definition, we use the function keyword. Not sure why we wouldn't use the function keyword, but when we refer to functions inside of objects, we tend to refer to them as methods. All right. So functions are how we define them. That's also what we use in the case of the procedural model of PHP. But in the case of the object-oriented realm, we're going to change that name from function. We're going to use the function keyword, but we're going to change the word to methods. All right, so that's my class. I got, 3 lines of code inside that class, nothing too glamorous there. And so we move down to line number 13, and now we start to see the actual object starting to take hold. So the first thing we want to do is, in order to leverage an object, we have to create it, right? Because when we have the class definition, all we have is the source code. It's like the recipe for the object, but we want to leverage the object by creating it. And we do that by using a special word called instantiate. That's a fancy term that says we're going to create an object, right? That's all we're doing is creating an object, so instantiate. Now, in this case, we're instantiating one instance of the object. It's called $new message. Right? We're using camel case notation there, and we're using the equal sign. Remember, equals, a single equal sign is assignment, and the new keyword indicates that I've got a class coming up here. So new, taking the class hello, and he's creating an object. And now what happens is that the hello class gets taken in, and the object is created from the class definition. So at this point in time, on line number 13, I've got a brand new entity, a new thing called an object, and all of the code that was in that class definition has now been copied into that object. All right, so now I've got all that power, all that functionality wrapped up into that object. And now I can do things with that that in most cases I wouldn't normally do. I could pass that to another function. I can pass it to another script. I can have all kinds of fun with this thing. Okay, now on line number 14, I'm taking $new message, and notice I'm using the dash greater than. right? The dash greater than. That basically is a character that, or a combination of characters that denotes an entity within the actual object. So in this case here, I'm going to manipulate a property, right? The message variable. Notice I'm not using a dollar sign because this is a property. It's not a true variable. It's a property, and I'm assigning the value hello world. Now I'm going to stop for a second here on line number 14 and talk about this for a second. Remember, up on line number 7, where we have $message defined, I used the public keyword before that. What that means is basically the same concept as the global keyword. If you think about the global keyword in a function basically means that somebody outside that function can pass a value in. All right, using that global keyword. It's one way of doing it. Well, in this case, by using the public keyword in front of $message, I'm basically saying people outside the object can manipulate that object. If I didn't have the public keyword in there, it would default to private, and of course private means that only functions or processes within the object can manipulate that property. And we'll reinforce that in a few minutes here, but at a high level, the reason I'm able to set message equal to hello world on line number 14 is simply because I have the public keyword on line number 7. It's important to be aware of that. All right, so I set the value of that property to hello world, and then I go ahead and I want to execute the function. Nope, that's not a function, it's a method. I want to execute the method called display. And to do that, it's as simple as saying $new message, and then I've got the dash greater than again, and then display with the open and close parenthesis. Now, display didn't have any parameters, so I'm not passing any parameters. It's not the end of the world. And what will happen is that when I execute that, we're going to get hello world. Let's see what it looks like here. All right, there's my class definition, and there's hello world. All right, so there's our output. Looks strangely familiar, right? We did a little bit of stuff there. Now let's go back to that previous display. It's worth mentioning here. Let's see here. Nope. Oh, that's all good. Here's our hello world example, and that's about as exciting as that gets. Now, let's talk about the components of an object a little bit more. All right. So in the case of objects, why would you not just use functions that are already in the global scope? Well, there's a variety of reasons why functions in the global scope in the procedural model may not be glamorous. First of all, there's no auto-loading mechanism for procedural code. So what that means is that every function would need to be loaded for each request over and over and over again. This becomes a performance issue. All right? So in this case, the object-oriented model of PHP can outperform the procedural model of PHP. First thing to keep in consideration. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that your structure is defined 100% by naming convention in the procedural world, right? When you look into the object-oriented world, you start to get into methods and properties that are owned by objects. Now, you've got a relationship between the class and its properties. Very important things to be aware of. All right, so using classes to structure the functionality means that only the required functionality is compiled at compile time, right? And your IFS access is minimized. This is a good thing, all right? Because one of the most expensive things you can do as a PHP developer is a round trip to the IFS. And then whatever you can do to minimize those round trips to the IFS becomes a very, very valuable thing from the performance of your application. It's not the end of the world to go back to read something from the IFS, but the reality is that the IFS is such a rich file system. It has so much power associated with it that it does have some baggage when you're reading and writing from it. So if you can minimize your round trips to the IFS, that's important. So things like the object-oriented model of PHP with the auto-loading mechanism, auto-loading features, becomes a very powerful way to improve the performance of your applications. Okay. Let's get back into properties. So class properties. Properties are typically referred to as data, right? It's data representative of the class. So in this case here, we're going to pick on customer. We're going to have a class called customer. What are some of the things that make up a customer? Well, name, address, city, state, zip. Think about your own environment in your organization. What things make up a customer definition? Maybe sales terms. Maybe you have credit terms. Maybe you have no credit terms. No credit for this customer, or another customer has all the credit they want because they're a great customer, and so on and so forth. Having all that defined in a certain place becomes pretty attractive. Now, I'm not talking about storing the data in the class. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about. Data gets stored in a database. Let's not get too muddy about that. But the class definition might be the way that I actually retrieve the data and then present it to my application. So I'm going to use the class as a way to access data, to access my business logic. Maybe I have one class for business logic, one class for data access, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways you're going to approach this kind of thing here. Now, class methods are essentially a function. We talked about this a few minutes ago, but let's reinforce this concept. Again, the object-oriented folks got to have their own name for things, right? We know them as functions, but they're called methods. And the main fundamental difference here is that a method is a component, it's a function inside of a class or an object. It's always referenced with the dash greater than kind of example there, at least in most cases. Now, in some cases, you use methods to provide some database access, maybe most oftentimes business logic. And in this example here, the method in this class definition is display. Right? We saw that execution a few minutes ago. So there's our method. Now, when we're creating the object, we did that very, very straightforward. $myObject equals new customer. There's an example. To destroy the object, sometimes people want to get rid of the object. Certainly, you can let the PHP script end, and that will remove the object from the system. But the other thing you can do is you can actually use the unset function. The unset function will get rid of an object. Unset becomes a very powerful tool because with unset you can do some very, very precise or very, very powerful things like you can delete elements in an array using unset. You can delete an entire array with unset. You can delete variables. You can also delete objects. So if you created an object or a series of objects and you want to get rid of them, you can use the unset as a keyword to handle that. All right, so let's get back into the object-oriented world a little bit more. Magic methods. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail about magic methods. I'm going to talk about two of them, the two most obvious ones in my humble opinion. Again, magic methods. Methods are functions, so basically you can call these magic functions, right? No, call them magic methods. That's what everybody calls them. They're kind of like special reserve functions in PHP, and I'll show you the correlation to RPG in a second. Typically, they begin with a double underscore, all right, and more information on these is available out of php.net. Again, it's a great place to go. Our higher structures course also covers them in detail. So, magic methods are essentially methods and objects that are called at special times, right? They always start with a double underscore. The constructor, destructor, call, get, set, sleep, wake up, and toString. So we've got a couple of basics there that are worth taking a look at. And we're going to focus in on constructor and destructor in this presentation, but certainly you can look at any of these other guys down here to get a head start on certain functionality you might want to use. Now the constructor, right? The constructor magic method. Think of it as the *inzsr for your object, right? Basically, what the constructor method what happens with the constructor is that when your object is instantiated, in other words, you've got a class definition out there, and I'm about to do the $myObject equals new customer, right? Something along those lines. As soon as I do the new customer, as soon as I instantiate that object, the constructor method fires, right? The constructor fires. So it's just like when you, in an RPG realm, right, where I have a *inzsr subroutine, when I fire up my RPG program, boom, I know *inzsr gets fired, and it always gets fired once when I fire up the program, right? So the constructor method is just like *inzsr. And what the constructor does, it will basically, it doesn't build the object. The object is built by the new keyword, all right? It's built. But what the constructor does is it basically does some internal plumbing. Maybe the constructor, if you have a data access object, for example, maybe the constructor creates a connection to a database, right? So that now you can go ahead and start reading and writing tables, right? Maybe the constructor is going to open up a resource connection to a file somewhere, to a stream file. The constructor can also do things like build arrays that are going to be used by other parts of the object and passed around the object. So there's a lot of things you can do with a constructor. For example, if you're reading a customer master record, and you want to instantiate an instance of the customer class, or the customer object, I should say, maybe you will call the you'll instantiate that new object by passing it a customer number. And what the constructor can do is it can say, aha, if I have a customer number, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go out to the customer table. I'm going to read in all the information for that customer so that when the object is done instantiating, I have all the information I need about a given customer right at my fingertips. So you don't have to go out and do an extra, set LL and a read equal and a chain and all this other stuff. It's all done in one step as you create the object. Again, very powerful stuff here. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but it's all stuff to consider. All right, now, if I've got a constructor, it would make sense that I might have a destructor. Okay, so the destructor basically is where I'm going to organize all my code that will run at the time the object is destroyed. So in this case, think of it as LR time, right? It's going to execute when the object is destroyed. In this case here, I again define the function underscore destruct, and I can put whatever business logic I want inside that function definition there. So now my magic method of a destructor will fire when I destroy the object. So let's take a look at what that looks like in an actual PHP script. In this case here, we've got our hello world script, and we're going to build upon it. Okay? So in this case, I've got my class hello, and there's my opening curly brace, and now my closing curly brace is down here. Why? Because in addition to the method and the property I had before, I've added in a constructor and a destructor. So notice the constructor is just going to basically spit out an H2 object created, and in the case of the destructor, it's going to spit out an H2 object destroyed. Okay? And then what will happen is down here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start playing with them, start manipulating these guys a little bit. So what ends up happening, let me see if that's going to come up here. Right? Star INCSR is my constructor. Think of a star INLR as my last record indicator. Oops, let's go back here. All right? And so what will happen is, in the case of $new message, all right, that's a variable. I'm going to instantiate one instance of the class. So at that point in time, right there, that's when the object is instantiated, and that's when the constructor fires, right at that point in time. So I'll get the output that says the object was created. Now, on the next line, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to assign the value hello world. Okay, so I'm setting up my property of message. I'm going to go ahead and display my message, and then I'm going to go ahead and destroy the object, at which point in time I'll get the output that says the object was destroyed. So that's a pretty straightforward approach to things. Now, we didn't talk too much about public and private and protected. Let's gloss over those really quick, and then I'll reinforce those with an example here. Public basically means that anyone, either inside or outside the object, can work with a method or a property. Okay, so that's what public means. It's basically like saying it's global in scope. But public's a little bit more, I say it's a little more acceptable than the global keyword is in the procedural model of PHP, because it really is a specific control that you're eliciting upon that object and its methods and its properties. Now, private basically means that if I have a property, a variable inside my object, my class definition, private basically means that the only thing that can manipulate that variable is something from within the object. So someone outside the object can't reach in and change something. I can't set a value for a property outside the object. I can only do it from within the object. This creates a level of safety and security that we've learned to accept and expect from, if the best example I can give you is local variables in a function definition. One of the nice things about function definition is that it has its own space. Well, the same thing applies with an object. It has its own space. Only a group of functions can work within that private space together and pass things to each other, but nobody from the outside can manipulate that and mess with them. Now, the protected keyword's a little bit more exotic, and basically what that means is that you can have access to properties and methods, within the object itself, or with other objects that extend the class. Now, I'm not going to get into extensions and that kind of stuff in this presentation here. I want to focus a little bit about the basics here. So, in the case of an application, I might use the public keyword to extend things within an application, within a class, within the class internals. Protected means that if I extend the class, I'm good, and of course I can use things internally within the object. And of course, private is only available. It's only available inside that object itself. So that's a nice little chart that, again, my good friend Kevin Schrader put together, and I will happily steal his content anytime because I know it's always good quality. And I usually try to give him credit for it, otherwise he'll probably beat me mercilessly. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So let's take a look at both the constructor, the destructor, and our visibility all in one example here. In this case here, what we've got is we've got our class hello. All right, we haven't changed the class at all, except that we've tweaked a couple of things here, right? One of the things we're going to do here is we're going to we've added an echo in here for private message. Okay, that's one thing we've done. We've also added a property for private message. All right, so we've got a public property and we've got a private property. Public is $message, private is $private message. All right, so public is accessible outside the object, private is only accessible inside the object. So let's go ahead and follow through our logic here and see what happens. So $new message equals new hello. So at that point in time, we instantiate an instance of the class hello. It's the object $new message, all right? And as soon as that is instantiated, what happens? Well, the constructor fires. Now, I want to show you this real quick. In Zen Studio, this is where this little code snippet was captured from. Inside Zen Studio, you have the ability to collapse things. And in this case, I collapsed the constructor and the destructor so all this code would fit on the page, on this presentation. But one of the things you can do is inside Studio is you hover over the ellipses over there, and you can see at a glance the full content of a function. It kind of makes things nice. But basically, if you remember the constructor, all the constructor would do is it would output with H2 headings, object created. So we can see over here, yes, I got my object created. I think I'm on the right track. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the property for message at H1 headings and hello world. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and I'm going to use the display method, which is basically set up as a public method, and the display method will go ahead and execute 2 lines of code. It's going to print this message, so we'll say, we'll print hello world. Okay. And then it's going to echo out $this private message. Remember, the private message is up here. It says this is the private message. Okay, so now I can see that, yes, it printed out the private message. We're all good. All right. Now, when I come down here, after I've executed my display method, I'm going to come down here to an if test. And in this case, I'm going to do an if test to see if I can access the private message. Now, this is where things start to get a little fuzzy, but it's worth taking a little time to understand this as clear as mud. In this example, I'm going to use the isSet function, all right, the isSet function, to determine if $new message, remember $new message is my object, that, dash greater than private message, okay, private message is the property inside of the class. If that is set, I'm going to go ahead and print it, else I'm going to print private message not found. Now, you'll notice that private message not found was what came out. That's because out here, in this line of code here, I am technically outside the object, okay? And if I'm outside the object, I can't access private properties or private methods, okay? So it's important to understand that whole public versus private thing because it helps you as a developer control your application. All right, you are in complete control. And by instantiating properties inside that object, okay, that are private, you are assured that nobody outside the object is going to manipulate that value. Okay, they can't directly manipulate that. It's a very powerful feature. And of course, when I do the unset, we see the object was destroyed, and all's well with the universe. Okay, off we go. So that was a high-level view of the object-oriented model of PHP. Again, I wasn't planning on getting into a deep dive here, but let's take a look at a practical case study, and let's not look at my code. Let's look at what I like to refer to as OPC, other people's code, or my good friend John Paris likes to say OPO, other people's objects. Right? I'm a big fan of learning as I go. In fact, if you think about it, way back when I learned RPG, I'll relate a quick story here. When I learned RPG, I walked into an RPG shop, and what did they do? What did they give me to work on at first? They gave me report programs, lots and lots of report programs. Why? Well, for 2 reasons. One is because report programs are easy. It's a great way to learn the basics of RPG as you grew. But 2, they weren't dangerous, right? Because report programs basically just open up files for read access only, and that was it. You never did updates in report programs until you got a little more skill under your belt, right? So it was a great place to get going and to learn my RPG code. Well, the same thing applies with PHP. It's a good way to grow into PHP. Start off with an inquiry, right? Read some data and present it on a screen. Well, as I grew, I started to look, I wanted to grow my knowledge. My curiosity was somewhat insatiable, so I wanted to learn more. So what did I do? I looked at other people's code. I looked at other people's programs. I looked at a subfile program, and I had to look at a subfile again and looked at it 2 or 3 more times before I started to really start to understand that kind of stuff. And quite honestly, it wasn't until I started working with subfiles that I really started to understand them. And in the case of the object-oriented model with PHP, the same can apply here. You don't need to know the entire world of OO in order to start to leverage it. That's what places like phpclasses.org are really, really good at doing. You can go out to a place like the website phpclasses.org and see thousands of examples of objects that you can use. You can also look at the Zen framework, and there's plenty of examples of how to use OO and Zen framework as well, because ZF is built on an object-oriented model. But the nice thing about the phpclasses.org is that there's tons and tons of stuff out there that you can leverage as you move forward. So it's real easy to weave objects into a procedural model of PHP as you're growing your skills and you're growing your knowledge. What I like to do is when I teach a class and stuff, I kind of show this as a very basic example. So phpclasses.org, you go out there, and what you can do is you can search for something. So you go in here, and the example I'm searching for here, one of the favorite things we like to look up is a regular expression for how to do email validation, right? There's always legendary discussions about how to validate email addresses, but regular expression is about one of the most powerful ways to do it. It's one of the most concise. It's also one of the most complex to understand too. So rather than invent the wheel, why not think about recycling it? So in this case, I type in email address validation, I click the Go button, and guess what? phpclasses.org finds 116 examples out there, okay? So I can pick one, any one that I want, and I go ahead and I grab one. And the one that I grab is written by a developer, let's see here, his name is Mahmoud Farak. I think he's based in Egypt. And the other nice thing about phpclasses.org is that people share their stuff with no license restrictions or no practical license restrictions. In this case, he's using GNU, and the whole idea is you can learn from this as well as leverage code, right? So in this example here, we can see some of the details about the class. As we page down a little bit, we can see that there's information about the class here. We've got a couple of groups and so on and so forth. But on the very bottom of the screen, you can see the files that are included. There's the emails.txt, which is basically some sample email addresses. Example.php, which is a working PHP example. And then there's the validate.class.php, which is what Mahmoud basically, in this case, indicates that's where he stores all of his logic. All of his class information is in there. Okay, so basically with these 3 files, I can download these, unzip them, drop them into the IFS of my IBM I, right? Just using iSeries Nav, I can do a drag and drop or FTP or whatever tool that you feel comfortable using. Put the files out there, and literally, as soon as you drop those files on the system, you can start to use them. Right? It's that no fancy business logic you need to do. In this case here, I took Mahmoud's example.php and I added a little code because while basically what his function does is it looks at a file, a text file, opens the text file, reads the list of email addresses, and then produces an associative array. With actually it's an associative. I think it might be a regular enumerated array. Basically, he produces an array of valid email addresses. So he sanitizes the list by producing the list of valid email addresses. So all I did was I added a little bit of code on lines 11 through 14 there to basically print the array, to display the array so we can actually see that the function worked. So when I do that, we can see here that the file over here has a lot of different examples in here, some that work, some that are valid email addresses, some that are obviously not. right? And then what we see here is in the enumerated array, we see all the valid email addresses that are displayed here based upon the rules that are set up in that business logic. Right? So whether you agree with that or not is a discussion for a different day, but there's an example of how easy it was to actually validate email addresses by going out to phpclass.org, getting a piece of code, and playing with it. Now, what if I don't want to do a batch-oriented type of an approach to the email validation? Maybe I have an interactive screen and I just want to validate one single email address at a time. I want to pass in a value and see the result, right? Well, one of the things I can do is I can open up the code that came with the validate.class.php, and there was a private function in there called check email. Well, all I had to do was go in and change that private function and make it a public function, and now I can access that directly from outside the object. All I have to do is instantiate the object of the validation class, and now I can actually use that method, that function, just as if I were writing procedural code if I wanted to. So again, there's an opportunity here to leverage things as you move forward. And the quick tweak to the code that I made is I kind of created some sample down here at the bottom of the code example here on line number 24. I'm basically taking a character string Joe at Joe's B, kind of sticking that into a field. I'm going to run the check email function once and echo out good or bad. So in this case, joesbeef.com is a good email address, but Joe at Joe's B is a bad email address. So I can see my validation logic is working. I can now leverage this business logic in my applications as I'm doing not only batch validation of email addresses, but I can use these pieces to do individual email address validation, like in a user input form or something like that. Okay. So where do you go next? Well, phpclasses.org is a darn good place to go next. We've got some great books out here for you. The PHP 5 Power Programming book, that's actually co-written by my boss, Andy Gutmans, and Eric Rathens and the gentleman's name I can't pronounce very well, so I'm not going to butcher it. Eli White has a great book. It's called PHP 5 in Practice, where he talks about the object-oriented model, a very powerful book. And, of course, the IBM Programmer's Guide to PHP. If you haven't purchased that book, it's worth exploring because there's a chapter, I believe it's chapter 10, that explores the object-oriented model, again, from an IBM I perspective and helps people, kind of grow their skills a little bit. Now, let's say you're comfortable with the procedural model of PHP, you've done the foundations course, or you've been doing enough procedural work where you're just plain comfortable enough. You're ready to move on to the next level. You want to take a class on object-oriented programming. Well, that's what our PHP 2 Higher Structures course is all about. It starts on June 13th, all right, and it's and of course we run it a couple of times a year, but it's always good to get in early and often for training at Zend. The Higher Structures course really focuses aggressively on the object-oriented model of PHP. It also covers a lot of other fundamental concepts like regular expression, that kind of stuff. But really, the whole idea of the Higher Structures course is a focus, is a deep dive on OO. So if you're comfortable with PHP, or you're getting comfortable with PHP, you're comfortable with that procedural world, you're ready to get into OO, Higher Structures is where you want to go. Now, if you haven't done any PHP at all, I really recommend that you explore the Foundations course first. All right, get that Foundations course under your belt. That also starts on June 13th. When you've got that down, you've done a little bit of programming, a little bit of coding, then you could jump into the Higher Structures course and really start to do the object-oriented development of PHP. Again, you could check that out in a variety of places. We've got awesome recorded webinars out there. We've got lots of stuff. Our new Flash Builder for PHP, our Flash Builder and Zen Studio product is out there. Webinars on that, webinars on Zen Server, Cluster Manager, Zen Server for IBM I. The main page is there as always. All of our manuals, all of our documentation is available, no charge. You can download that early and often from our website. Please take a look at that, especially if you're installing. Zen Server 5.1 for IBM I was just announced about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and it's available for download. Two really awesome features of Zen Server for IBM I. First is the fact that we now have an Oracle connector, so you can connect to an Oracle database from the IBM I. So if you've got Oracle in your shop, you can leverage that moving forward. The second thing is that we are introducing in Zen Server 5.1, which, by the way, Zen Server 5.1 is a GA release. But there is one component inside that GA release, inside of Zen Server 5.1, that is a beta, and it is our new open source toolkit. And that new toolkit is designed to give you some new alternatives to accessing IBM I resources. So more on that in an upcoming webcast really soon. Okay, so the PHP conference, ZenCon, is coming up. It's October 17th through the 19th in Santa Clara, California. We're going to have pre-conference workshops. We're going to have lots of content on PHP, clustering, IBM I, all kinds of information that'll really knock your socks off, and it's a great opportunity to network with some really, really awesome PHP developers from around the world. We gather once a year in the Silicon Valley area, and we'd love to see you out there. Please consider getting on the early bird registration for ZenCon. We'd love to see you. And with that, I'm going to open up the floor to Q&A. Let's see here. I need to go back to. I'm going to leave the sharing up. Let's see here. I need to look at your questions. Great. Okay. Okay, we have one person who lost the audio, but apparently they came back. What is the $this construct for? I may have missed it, but not sure. No, Ken, you're absolutely right. I apologize for glossing over that. So let me switch my view, if I may. Interesting. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second here. And I'm going to go back to sharing the presentation. And actually, cancel. Let me go ahead and ask. Can you guys see my presentation okay at this point? I'm going to jump back to the code. Okay, thanks, Ken. So going back into the code, so here we go. In this case, $this. $this is I apologize for glossing over this, or actually I didn't even gloss over it, I didn't even cover it. $this is a reserved word in the object-oriented model of PHP. Okay, so inside of an object, what $this refers to, $this refers to this instance of an object. Now, of course, we have to write the code inside the class. Remember, the class is the recipe for the object. But what $this basically references is a property, a method, or in the case of a method or a property of this object. All right, so $this is how you would refer to message. So in the case of the property dollar message, I want to refer to that within the actual object itself. I would use $this and then dash greater than message, and then $this dash greater than private message. So hopefully that helps that perspective a little bit as you move forward. But let's see here if there's any other questions. Here we go. So Ken, did that answer your question? Is that good for you there? Great. Any other questions? By all means, fire away, and we'll go ahead and we'll keep moving forward. Let's see here. So the let's see, there's another question here. This is Mike. Can you call objects from within functions within methods? Well, basically. Yes, sort of. Okay, so let's be clear about this. From within the procedural model of PHP, you can leverage objects. All right, and as I'm going to jump forward a little bit here to the example that I had, where I'm actually mixing and matching, so to speak, my PHP code here. Notice in this case here, I've got a PHP script. I am basically running the code. From the example.php, right, where I'm basically going to just instantiate an instance of the array or the array manager in this case. I'm going to validate things by running the execute method, and then I basically get out an array, right? But essentially, I can be within the procedural model of PHP. I can leverage the object-oriented model of PHP as I'm moving forward. So you can mix and match as you see fit. Now, one of the things that I didn't cover in this presentation that I want to make sure you're aware of. So Zend Framework, as a framework, is built on the object-oriented model of PHP. And Zend Framework is also what we call a component-based framework. The reason it's a component-based framework is that the original architects for Zend Framework believed that in order to make the framework useful, it had to be flexible. In other words, there are some frameworks out there, which I won't name in this discussion, but there are some frameworks out there that require you to be 100% framework all day and all night, right? And that could be a good thing. It could be a painful thing, right? So that means you have to understand the framework from day one. In the case of Zend Framework, however, it's a component-based framework, which means you can use within the procedural model or the object-oriented model of your PHP script, you can use those components of the Zend Framework simply by instantiating an object that is the Zend Framework component and using it. So you can really leverage Zend Framework in your procedural code as well as in your public code by using things like, Zend PDF, right? If you want to generate a PDF from a procedural PHP script, you can use the Zend PDF object management model to go ahead and leverage that as you move forward. So those are some great questions. Well, I'm running a little bit late here, folks, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up, and what we can do is we can follow up with some of your questions after the presentation. I want to thank you for your time today, and I appreciate you guys coming. One of the things I always love to hear from you guys is what other webinars you'd like to see. So shoot me a note. I am mike.p@zend.com, or you can let us know at Zend what you're looking for. And if there's anything else we can help you with, just give us a shout, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.